A wave of warriors in feathered headgear carved onto a temple wall in Egypt. Burning cities up and down the coast. A people who seemed to appear from the sea, out of nowhere, and then melt back into history. For 3,000 years, no one could say where the Philistines truly came from. The old texts argued, the ruins hinted, no one had ever asked their bones. DNA says otherwise. Their name has echoed for millennia. In the old stories, they are the great rivals, the enemy across the border, a people of iron and war. But strip away the legend, and a real question remains, one that historians fought over for a very long time. Who were they, actually? Where did these people come from? And why did they seem so different from everyone around them? The search for an answer centers on one place, an ancient seaport on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, a city called Ashkelon. It was one of the great Philistine cities, and it sat right on the coast, facing out toward the water. For decades, archaeologists dug through its layers, and what they found there was strange. Somewhere around 3,200 years ago, the city changed, almost overnight. The pottery changed, the architecture changed, the tools, the jewelry, even the food changed. And the new styles did not look local at all. They looked like something from far across the sea, from the world of the Aegean, the islands and shores around ancient Greece. It was as if a new people had walked into an old city and brought their whole way of life with them. Historians had a name for the moment this happened. It was part of one of the strangest events in ancient history, the collapse of the Bronze Age, when great civilizations all around the Mediterranean fell within a single generation. And moving through that chaos were mysterious raiders the Egyptians recorded on their temple walls, a coalition they called the Peoples of the Sea. The Egyptians left the fullest record of them. On the walls of a great temple, a pharaoh carved his account of a desperate sea battle against these invaders, showing warriors in strange feathered crowns crowded into their ships. He listed the peoples of their coalition by name, and among them was one whose name would outlast all the others. In the centuries that followed, that people would settle the southern coast, raise cities like the one beneath the archaeologists' trowels, and become the great rivals written into legend. But the carvings only showed a single moment of battle. They could not say where these people had first sailed from, or who they truly were beneath the feathers and the bronze. But here is where the trouble began. Pottery is not people. A city can change its style through trade, through fashion, through conquest by a small ruling class without a single family ever moving in, so the deepest question stayed open. Before I tell you what the bones revealed, decide for yourself. When that ancient city suddenly filled with foreign styles from across the water, was it because a real wave of people had sailed in and settled? Or were these the same local families as before, simply borrowing a fashionable new look from their trading partners overseas? Migrants, or locals in new clothes? Choose a side and hold it. For a long time, scholars were split down the middle, and both sides had a real case. One camp read the ancient texts and the sudden cultural break as proof of invasion. The old writings spoke of the Philistines arriving from a distant land, of survivors washing up on new shores after their own world burned. To this camp, the peoples of the sea were exactly what they seemed. A migration, refugees and raiders from the collapsing Aegean world landing on the coast and making it their own. The other camp was more cautious. They pointed out how often archaeologists had been fooled before, mistaking a change in style for a change in blood. Perhaps, they argued, the local population had simply adopted foreign fashions, the way people everywhere copy the styles of a richer or more glamorous culture. In this view, there was no great fleet, no mass arrival, just local people dressing in the latest imported trend. For the better part of a century, this was a stalemate. Each new dig turned up more pottery, more walls, more fuel for both sides, and no way to choose between them. The question had hardened into one of those famous unanswerable puzzles of archaeology, the kind passed down from one generation of scholars to the next, still unsolved. The two sides could argue forever, because they were both working from the same silent evidence. Broken pots, old walls, faded inscriptions written by their enemies. None of it could speak to the one thing that would settle the matter: where the actual bodies came from. For that, you would need to read the people themselves. And for a long time, that was impossible. Then, at last, the technology caught up. A team of scientists set out to do what no one had managed before. They would pull genetic material directly from the ancient dead of Ashkelon and read it. They gathered the remains of 10 individuals, spanning the exact centuries in question, from before the Great Change to well after it. The idea was simple and powerful. Build a genetic timeline of a single city and watch what happened to its people across the transition. The material came from the hardest, most protected parts of the skeleton, the dense bone of the inner ear and the teeth, the places where fragile genetic code can survive the longest. Across those 10 people, the team read more than 1 million points in the genome. For 100 years, the origin of the Philistines had been a war of opinions. DNA says otherwise, because when the results came in, they did not read like an argument, they read like a story, told in 3 acts. The first act was the oldest layer, the people of the city before the Great Change. Their code was clear. They were local. Genetically, they matched the other populations of the region, the deep-rooted people of the eastern Mediterranean coast. Nothing foreign, nothing from across the sea, just the long-standing families of the land. This was the baseline, the before picture. Then came the second act, and it changed everything. In the layer from the time of the Great Cultural Break, the team examined the remains of several infants, babies who had been buried beneath the floors of the houses of Ashkelon. And their code told a completely different story. A large share of their ancestry, in some cases the majority of it, traced not to the local region at all, but to southern Europe. The closest matches lay far across the water, in the ancient Aegean, and on islands like Sardinia and along the coast of the distant west. The foreign styles had not arrived alone. They had arrived inside actual human beings who had crossed the sea and settled and were now burying their children beneath their new homes. There was the answer. The migration was real. The peoples of the sea were not a myth or a fashion. They were flesh and blood, and they had come from the west, exactly as the oldest legends whispered. But the story had a third act, and it is the strangest of all. The team kept reading, moving forward in time to the people of the city just a couple of centuries later, and the foreign signal was fading. In the later population, that strong European ancestry had thinned out, diluted, blended back down into the local gene pool. Give it a little more time, and it became almost undetectable. The newcomers had arrived in force, and then, within just a few generations, they had married so thoroughly into the local population that their distinct genetic signature all but vanished. It is one of the quietest disappearances in history. No sudden catastrophe erased them, no plague, no second invasion. They simply married and had children, and their children married in turn, until the sea in their ancestry was diluted down to nothing, generation by generation, in the ordinary rhythm of families joining families. Think about what that means. A people sailed across the sea, toppled into a new land, gave that land a new culture and a famous new name, and left their mark all over the history books. And yet, in their very blood, they dissolved almost without a trace, absorbed into the people who were already there. They conquered the culture and were swallowed by the bloodline. So what does a discovery like this change? It settles one of the oldest debates in the ancient world, and it does it with a precision no pot could ever provide. The Philistines really did come from across the sea. There really was a migration, out of the collapsing west into the eastern shore. The legends had a kernel of hard truth inside them all along. But it also hands us something deeper and stranger. It shows how a people can be enormously important and genetically almost invisible at the same time. Culture and blood do not always travel together. You can change a civilization forever and still be swallowed within a few centuries into the population you found there. The Philistines are remembered as outsiders, the eternal foreigners. Their genes say they became quite quickly the very locals they had once sailed in against. Earlier, I asked you to choose migrants or locals in new clothes. If you said migrants, the DNA is on your side. A real wave of people really did cross that sea. But if you leaned toward locals, you were not entirely wrong either, because within a few generations that is almost exactly what the migrants became. Which leaves the question the code cannot yet fully answer. Where precisely did that fleet set out from? The genetic signal points to the west, to the Aegean, to Sardinia, to the far coasts of southern Europe, but the exact harbour, the exact people who first pushed their boats into the water and sailed toward a burning world is still out there, waiting in the ground. Tell me where you think they came from. A carving of sea raiders on an Egyptian wall. A city that changed overnight. 4 infants beneath a floor carrying the code of a homeland across the water. For 3,000 years we asked where the Philistines came from and answered with guesses and old stories. DNA says otherwise. They came from the sea, just as the legends said, and then they vanished into the very land they had conquered, remembered forever as strangers, while their blood quietly became the blood of home. Discovery continues. Thanks for watching. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and turn on notifications. We cover DNA mysteries, ancient forensics, and the cases history tried to forget.